The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar brought to you by the Motor Safety Association. My name is Nathan Kostrin, and today our topic is going to be about Workplace Specific WHMIS, or some of you may also know it as Site Specific WHMIS Training. We felt this was an important topic to cover, as many people oftentimes conflate WHMIS 2015 education training with Workplace Specific WHMIS Training. And while the two are both important, there are distinct differences in what information is covered in each. And today we're going to clarify some of that and what makes them different and how you can implement both effectively in your workplace because they're meant to work together. Just so you know, your microphones have been muted and they will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. However, if you have any questions as we move through the webinar, please feel free to enter them into the question box. And at the conclusion of the webinar, I'll review all the questions, provide answers to them, and send the responses out to those who had those questions. So, while we could spend hours discussing the topic of WHMIS, and many of you have taken WHMIS training, WHMIS 2015, and you could vouch for this, we're going to keep the information to the point and brief for the purpose of time during the webinar. I've got about an hour or less to give you all this information, so we're going to try and stay a little bit more on point. If you have any follow-up questions, like I said, please enter them in and we'll follow up with you at a later point and get your questions answered. But today what we're going to primarily cover is WHMIS 2015. What exactly is it and what are the responsibilities of those in the workplace? We're also going to touch on and speak more to the workplace specific or site specific WHMIS training. So what is that exactly? What's the main differences between WHMIS 2015, the generic training that most workers will receive, and workplace specific WHMIS education and training. And then finally, we're just going to cap it all off with discussing how to implement an effective WHMIS program at your workplace. So those are going to be the main topics of discussion today. So let's jump right in and let's start by discussing what is WHMIS 2015 exactly. Well, WHMIS 2015, like I said, majority of you have probably taken it or have administered this sort of training to your workers, typically through a third party. But what WHMIS is it stands for the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System 2015. So it is a comprehensive hazard communication system that provides health and safety information on hazardous products in the workplace, which are intended for use, handling, or storage, and ensures workers have access to the necessary knowledge and tools to handle hazardous products safely. WHMIS is regulated in the workplace by the different provinces, territories, and federal governments under their occupational health and safety legislation. So in our Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations, we have our own WHMIS legislation here in Saskatchewan. WHMIS aligns with GHS, which most of you know now as the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. And so that's where we saw this WHMIS 2015 transition take place. And like I said, if you've taken WHMIS 2015, they speak directly about what that changeover looked like. And I'm just going to cap on it really quick or go over it really quickly with you so that everyone's kind of in the know. So the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals is an international initiative to standardize chemical hazard classification and communication globally and improve consistency in the identification and communication of hazards in workplaces. So this was developed because many different countries had different systems for classification and labeling of chemical products. And so depending on where you were getting those products from, if it was coming from China, the US, Australia, wherever that was coming from, there's a chance that you could end up with the same product with a different label. So that was the whole point of this GHS system, was to harmonize some of this, standardize it across the board so that majority of the countries will be using the same system. Canada adopted the GHS system, as well as many of our trade partners have, including the United States. And the GHS system, it wasn't meant to replace WHMIS. Canada just merely adopted that GHS system by revising our existing WHMIS legislation. Some of the incorporated elements were resulted in new standardized hazard classification criteria, labeling requirements, and safety data sheet requirements, which were formerly known as material safety data sheets. So before you knew them as MSDS, now under the GHS system, they're known as SDS, or just safety data sheets. But overall, WHMIS 2015 ensures that workers have the necessary information and training to protect themselves from hazardous materials, and it empowers them to work safely and contribute to a safer work environment for everybody. So what exactly are products covered, or what products are covered by WHMIS? So in kind of a condensed version, the hazardous product regulations set out specific hazard classification criteria. If a product is covered by the Hazardous Products Act, it meets the criteria to be included in a hazard class or category, it's considered to be a hazardous product. And I'll actually be sending you out that Hazardous Product Act and regulations at the conclusion of the webinar so that you have a copy of that and you can refer to it if you need to or like to read more into that. All hazardous products used in the workplace are covered by WHMIS regulations, and a WHMIS program, including education and training, must be in place when you're dealing with hazardous products at your workplace. So, which leads us in our next topic about what is exactly education and training. Again, two things where people sometimes get them a little bit confused on which one's which. Fortunately, our legislation defines under our WHMIS, the part of WHMIS in the regulations, it defines what education and training means. So it states that education means the delivery of general information to workers, whereas training means the delivery of work site and job specific information to workers. So for the context of what we're talking about, education would be general or portable information such as how WHMIS works and the hazards of the product. So this would all be covered in your WHMIS 2015 training, right? It's giving you the general information of what is covered. So for example, you'll learn about the hazard classes, right? Why a product is called a corrosive and what information you can find on labels and safety data sheets and things like that. Training is site and job specific information that's going to cover your workplace's procedures for storage, handling, use, disposal, emergencies, spills, everything kind of that's more specific to your work site. That's what you're going to cover off in your work site specific training, or workplace specific. So let's quickly go over what everybody's responsibilities are regarding WHMIS. So quickly, the supplier responsibilities are to properly classify their products. So they need to classify their hazardous products according to the specific hazard classes and categories that are outlined in WHMIS 2015. The classification is based on properties and potential risks associated with that product. Labeling, they are required to, are responsible for providing accurate and compliant labels for their hazardous products. Labels need to include the product identifiers, supplier information, hazard pictograms, signal words, hazard statements, etc. I'm going to actually show you an example of what that's going to look like. And the labels must be clear, visible, and easily understandable so that workers can quickly identify and comprehend what the hazards are associated with the product. In terms of safety data sheets, they need to provide and prepare and provide, I should say, safety data sheets, which were, like I said, were formerly known as material safety data sheets. They need to provide these for all hazardous products, and they should be included in any packaging that you would procure from them. Safety data sheets contain the detailed information about the composition, physical and chemical properties. It's going to go over the handling and storage procedures, first aid measures, emergency response controls. All of those things are going to be included on a safety data sheet. They need to be accurate, up to date, and readily accessible. And then finally, notification and updates. Suppliers have a responsibility to actually notify the appropriate authorities such as Health Canada of any new or significant information regarding the hazards of their products. This includes updates to hazard classifications, labeling, or any changes made to safety data sheets. And I'm going to try and actually include a link for you folks at the end of the webinar as well when I send out materials to you. There's actually on the Government of Saskatchewan website, you can register for, I forget where it is, but you can essentially register on that website under kind of it's a bit of a WHMIS program they have where if they receive new information, that will actually, if you're signed up or registered for this, it'll actually update you on any changes that have been made, and they'll email those changes out to you. So it'll allow you kind of make it a lot easier, I guess, for you to manage any sort of updates that you need to be aware of on an ongoing basis. For employer responsibility, so this is an important one, and I'm just going to touch on these, but because we're going to get more deeper into them as we go through the webinar. But essentially, the employer's responsibility is to make sure their workers are trained and educated on the hazards and safe use of the hazardous products they use at the workplace. They're expected to ensure that hazardous products are, properly labeled. So in the absence of a supplier label, maybe it's deteriorated, maybe the product's been decanted, they still need to ensure that there's some sort of label on that. And we're going to touch on what workplace labels will look like. And they are required to either have one or the other, essentially. And I'll kind of cover off what that should look like here momentarily. They're also required to prepare workplace labels and safety data sheets as necessary and provide access to workers of up-to-date safety data sheets. Something that we often see is we'll see that they have a company has safety data sheets, but they're not readily accessible. They might be in a different building. They might be kind of somewhere in a cupboard off, in another department, whatever the case is. We want very quick access to these. And the reason for that is if we have an emergent situation, and you folks would know, if you look at your safety data sheet binders, I've rarely ever found a safety data sheet binder that was, 12 chemicals or less. Typically there's, 50, 75, 100 chemicals potentially in there. The importance of having access to those is we can't expect the workers to remember all of the information contained on every safety data sheet. So when we have an emergency situation, we need quick access to them. Somebody might take that worker, let's say, to an eye wash station, while somebody should say, hey, go get the safety data sheet for this immediately so that we can figure out how long do we need to rinse their eyes out for and any other protocols we might need to take into consideration. So that's the importance of having very quick access to these. And too often times we find them kind of tucked away somewhere where we want readily available access to them. So that's an important thing to consider and consider, I guess, where are you keeping your safety data sheets? Are they readily accessible? Can people get to them quickly if we have an emergency situation? And then finally, ensure appropriate control measures are in place to protect the health and safety of workers. This goes as far as personal protective equipment, having eye wash stations available, fire extinguishers readily available, spill kits, and all kinds of things, depending on what types of hazardous products you're using at your business. Worker responsibility. So workers, they're expected to participate in any WHMIS education and training programs that are provided by their employer. That training is going to equip them with the knowledge and skills that are necessary to understand what the hazards are associated with those products that they're handling and using, and what the proper handling procedures are, what kind of PPE they should be using. And workers need to actively engage in training sessions, ask questions and seeking clarity to ensure that they have a good understanding of what the hazards are for these products. Where can I find more information? Things like that. Workers also need to be able to recognize and identify hazards in the workplace. That's why they need to understand the meaning of certain hazard pictograms, labels, the safety data sheets. They need to understand what that information means and how they can access it. Being able to recognize those hazardous materials and the risks involved with using them, workers can take appropriate precautions to protect themselves from potential harm. And that's why that's so essential. In terms of reporting hazards and things like that, workers obviously have a duty to report any hazards, incidents, near misses, things like that are related to hazardous products that they use. They need to ensure that they report situations to their employer or supervisor as soon as possible. This includes any spills, leaks, improper storage, any situation that could pose a risk to them or their coworkers. Reporting hazards helps ensure prompt action is going to be taken to mitigate those risks and maintain that safe work environment. Workers are also responsible for the hazardous materials handling hazardous materials safely according to that information training that's provided to them. That includes, again, the instructions on labels and safety data sheets and using that appropriate PPE, storing these materials appropriately, disposing of them appropriately. They need to be aware of what the potential risks are and again, take necessary precautions to minimize exposure and prevent accidents from happening. And then finally, in terms of PPE, workers need to use that PPE as instructed by their employer and based on the required PPE mentioned in safety data sheets. This may include gloves, safety glasses, respiratory protection, other equipment specific to the hazards that they might encounter using that product. So proper use of that PPE is going to help them minimize the risk of exposure to materials and protect them from potential harm. Oftentimes we see not the appropriate PPE used for certain products, or possibly we come across respirators that have filters that have expired 5 years ago. These are all situations that can cause a potential incident to occur. And so we need to really take into consideration all of these elements when we're looking at our WHMIS program and our site-specific WHMIS. Speaking of, let's get into what exactly is site-specific WHMIS and what are some of the key differences between that and the generic WHMIS 2015 training that most of you put your workers through or have taken through work. Because keep in mind, workplace safety, that's of paramount importance when we're talking about this stuff. And the WHMIS 2015 plays a critical role in ensuring the well-being of your employees when they're using these products. And while WHMIS provides that standardized framework for the hazard communication, the implementation of site-specific WHMIS further enhances safety by addressing the unique workplace hazards at your business. So here's kind of a quick definition when we talk about what exactly is workplace or site-specific WHMIS. It's the implementation of WHMIS in a specific workplace that takes into account the unique hazardous products and circumstances present at that work site, right? That is what we're talking about when we talk about workplace or site-specific WHMIS. We're looking at what is in the workplace. So think of that information that you get from WHMIS 2015 as being more of that general information and training, where the workplace specific is now we're looking at our own workplace. What kind of products are we carrying and what are our emergency procedures for dealing with these things? We're getting into that site specific level of things. Now, in developing your own WHMIS program or a site specific WHMIS program, this is going to enhance and also supports the three workers' rights that we have, right? The right to know. We have the right to know what the hazardous products are, any information associated with those products, and how to keep ourselves safe when using those products. Workers have the right to participate. So the employer has a responsibility to consult with their health committee when they're developing an effective WHMIS program at their workplace. And this supports that right to participate in health and safety at the workplace. And then finally, the right to refuse. If a worker hasn't been trained in the use of a hazardous product or possibly even the personal protective equipment, let's say a respirator, for example, they haven't been fit tested, but they're required to use a certain type of respirator that requires that tight fit, they have the right to refuse that work. They can refuse that work until they have the appropriate training to deal with that hazard. So again, having a really good site-specific WHMIS program in place is going to support these workers' rights and avoid any sort of work refusals potentially that can result of it. So what I want to do here now is we're going to kind of shift gears, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the differences between what do we mean by WHMIS 2015, kind of that general information. What do we mean by workplace specific, and give you some examples of each. And then we're going to cap things off with going over the implementation of a program at your workplace. So let's get into this a bit. We're going to start with hazard identification. So when we're talking about hazard identification, while the WHMIS 2015 or that generic WHMIS training provides general guidance on identifying hazards, the site-specific involves conducting a more thorough hazard assessment specific to your workplace. So this assessment is going to help you identify the unique hazards present, such as different chemicals, machinery, processes that are going to pose risk to employees. So here's an example of the difference between these two. So here you can see we have different pictograms here and of the various different types of labels and pictograms you might see on hazardous products at your business, right? You can see we've got probably the ones that you see more often than not is the flame, right? That's for fire hazards. The flame over the circle is for oxidizing hazards. We often see the gas cylinder for gases under pressure, corrosion for corrosive materials. So this is generic information, right? This is what you learned in your WHMIS 2015, what these pictograms are, what they mean, and there's an explanation behind them. What is a corrosive? What is a flammable? What is a health hazard, right? And they get into detail in that in your general WHMIS training. When we go to the site-specific level, now what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to take all of these hazardous products and we're going to develop an inventory list for them. So as you can see, I've got two examples for you. We've got the chemical name down one column. So these are the products. They've got a risk rating, which I really like in here, which you can do yourself with your own risk assessment tool. If you need help developing one for classifying these products, let us know. We can certainly help you out with that. But I love how they've graded them in terms of the risk level, because this is also going to clue workers into, hey, this is a fairly high risk or dangerous product. I should probably read more into this before I use it, right? So we've got some indicators here. I also love the fact that they have a storage category, which is going to tell you in terms of how this product needs to be stored. You can see some require a flammable cabinet. We've got some that require just a base cabinet. Some are for corrosives. So it tells you exactly what kind of storage category they fall under, so that, again, we know what the risk is and we know how to store this product as well. They have a hazards column that tells you what hazards are associated with that product. And then on the last two, they're not filled out, but definitely have these filled out. We've got the number of containers or the amount of the product that we're going to potentially use at our workplace. So all of these are essential. And here's another example. This one looks like it was maybe an example from a university or something, but they've got, again, the manufacturer, supplier's chemical name, manufacturer, the supplier. They've got the max quantity that they keep on site. They've got kind of risk categories for them and a bunch of other information. The current safety data sheet or material safety data sheet for that product. So that's going to allow them to make sure that they are up to date when they're reviewing this. If you do an annual review on your safety program, you're going to be able to see very quickly which safety data sheets might be up to date or out to date, and allow you to kind of act accordingly. So this is, again, the difference between that site-specific versus general WHMIS, right? This is a very essential part of what you folks need to know. Let's get into communication and labeling a little bit. So again, WHMIS provides standard labeling requirements for hazardous materials, and you can see those different pictograms there. Site-specific WHMIS goes a step further by customizing labels and communication to reflect hazards specific to the workplace. So let's have a look at what this looks like. So this would be a standard label. These are going to look different based on the supplier or manufacturer of the product. Supplier labels are going to be different, like I said, based on who is providing or supplying that product to you. But this is just a standard example of a standard label of a supplier. They've got the product identifiers in here. Supplier information, right? The name, address, contact info. We've got the pictograms here, the WHMIS labels that visually represent the major hazard classes or categories associated with that material. So the pictograms are the black symbols on a white background, often enclosed in that red diamond shape that you see there. And the type and number of pictograms will depend on the material or the hazardous product, right? We've got signal words just underneath there. So again, it'll say danger, warning, right? Danger is used for more severe hazards or risks. Warning is used for less severe hazard or risk. So again, essential information for employees to know. We've got precautionary statements there as well. They outline the recommended measures to prevent or minimize hazards associated with the material. They provide guidance on safe handling, storage, and use, as well as the appropriate PPE that you should be using. And then there's some supplementary information in there as well. So it's important to note that the elements on a WHMIS label, they're going to vary slightly, again, depending on the jurisdiction, regulations, or the supplier we're getting it from. However, the overall purpose remains the same, right? We want to clearly communicate hazards associated with the material or product and provide that information for safe handling and use. Now, that was kind of our more general information, right? That is what's provided by the supplier. How about when we look at site-specific level? Well, at the site-specific level, it states in our legislation that we've got certain requirements when we decant products into other containers. And I'm just going to kind of summarize what our legislation states. It says, if a hazardous product at a place of employment is in a container other than the container in which the hazardous product was received from a supplier, an employer shall ensure that a workplace label is applied to the container in which the hazardous product is placed. It does not apply to a portable container that is filled directly from a container that has a supplier label or workplace label applied to it if all of the hazardous product in the portable container is required for immediate use, or all of the following conditions are met. The hazardous product is under the control of and used exclusively by the worker who filled the portable container and used only during the shift in which the portable container was filled, and the contents of the container are clearly identified. So I think there's a bit of a misconception too about how this is done. Oftentimes what I'll see when I'm doing inspections is somebody will actually they'll just write with a Sharpie, which can be fine. On a decanted product, they'll, whatever it is, we'll say brake cleaner is always one that comes to mind. So brake cleaner or transmission fluid or whatever it is, and they'll just write that on the bottle. That's fine if that product is under the immediate control of the person who decanted it, and all of that product is going to be used before the end of that work shift, right? This does not apply, however, to products where we've decanted them and into a different container for maybe just easier use or whatever the case is. And now that product is actually just sitting on a shelf for days, weeks, maybe months on end. That does not apply to those scenarios, right? That product needs to be used by the end of the shift and be under the control of the person who decanted the product. That's where these labels, or what you're seeing in front of you right now on our PowerPoint, this is the type of workplace label you would put on one of those products if we're going to, again, be using this for an extended period of time, days, weeks, months, whatever the case is. Possibly the supplier label is not legible or it's peeled off. We apply a workplace label to it, and that's what this is. You can go to your safety data sheet and get all of this information so that we know what the product identifier is, what the pictograms say, what PPE we should be using, and any other information that you think might be relevant. We actually, as a safety association, we have several of these that we can hand out to businesses. So if you want some workplace labels, let us know. We can drop some off at your workplace. But these need to be applied. And again, when we talk about the employer being required to update safety data sheets and workplace labels as needed, that's what we mean by this. It's not good enough to just write, something on a container with a Sharpie for everything, right? Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes we need to go a step further and put this workplace label on the product. Training and education. So I'm just going to touch on it here because I'm going to touch on it more extensively here towards the end. But let's just kind of generally go through this. So again, WHMIS 2015 is that general education and training on hazards and safe handling practices of products, right? We kind of talked about that and what's included, and I'm going to go over in more detail what's going to be in WHMIS 2015 opposed to your site-specific here momentarily. Site-specific is going to be addressing those specific hazardous products that you use at your business and any risk present. So that includes training on your specialized personal protective equipment, any emergency response protocols that you have, and things like that that are specific to your work site. So again, key components that are included typically in your WHMIS 2015, they'll give you an overview of WHMIS, what is it exactly, they'll touch on what the hazard classes and categories are. This includes understanding the various types of hazards associated with it, physical and health hazards. They'll go over the WHMIS symbols and pictograms and kind of familiarizes workers with the various symbols and different hazard classes. It explains the meaning and significance of each symbol, and it's going to help them quickly identify the hazards associated with those products they're using. They're going to review what safety data sheets are, and educate workers on the purpose and content that's contained in safety data sheets. They're going to learn how to access and interpret that information. And that includes understanding the information on chemical composition, physical properties, safe handling procedures, emergency protocols, and first aid, things like that. They also go over WHMIS labels, so that training is going to cover the importance of those WHMIS labels and how to read and interpret the information on them. They're going to learn the product identifiers, supplier information, hazard symbols, signal words, hazard statements, all that stuff. They're going to learn about safe handling procedures. So that training emphasizes the importance of safe handling practices when working with hazardous materials, and includes, again, proper storage, handling, disposal, wearing the appropriate PPE, any control measures that they can put in place that's going to minimize exposure. With emergency response, workers are educated in WHMIS 2015 on procedures related to hazardous materials. That includes kind of understanding evacuation protocols, spill response measures, and the importance of reporting incidents or exposures at their workplace. Rights and responsibilities. So again, we covered off kind of what the workers' rights are. This would also be included in the WHMIS training, and also what their general responsibilities are under WHMIS, including that right to receive the information, right, the importance of reporting hazards, and their role in maintaining a safe working environment, and review and evaluation. And that the training concludes kind of a review of the key concepts and means for evaluating workers and their understanding of WHMIS through typically a test or a quiz at the conclusion of that training. At a site-specific level, again, this is ensuring the availability of up-to-date and accurate safety data sheets for the hazardous products that they're using specific to the workplace. Includes obtaining safety data sheets from suppliers and maintaining, again, an inventory list of them, and ensuring we have up-to-date safety data sheets. Providing training and education programs that cover the specific hazards, safe handling procedures, emergency protocols, and PPE that are relevant to your workplace and the products that you're using. So again, this requires a bit of a deep dive into those safety data sheets, finding out what are the hazards associated with the products. Do we need eye wash stations? How many? What kind of eye wash station do we need, right? Is a 15-minute portable one okay? Or do we need something plumbed in so that we have water for as long as we need it to flush those eyes? Maybe we need to flush it for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, possibly, right? So we want to understand what are our site-specific hazards with the products we're using, so that we can procure the proper equipment to deal with those hazards, and then train our workers on the usage of that equipment if something were to happen. Going kind of a step further with that emergency preparedness piece too is, including your evacuation plans. What kind of spill response controls do we have on site? What are our communication systems for if we have an emergency that takes place? Designated assembly points, so your muster points, where are they? So it's really training people up on what our site-specific protocols are, and how to execute them efficiently and effectively. When we're talking about site-specific training and education, the key walk-away points that a worker should know after they take this training is, if I'm looking at a hazardous product, what is the hazard? How do I protect myself? What kind of PPE do I need to use? What kind of safety precautions do I need to take? And what should I do in the event of an incident? What are our emergency protocols if I'm exposed to a hazardous product, right? Is it take me to the eye wash station? Well, somebody grabs that safety data sheet and start flushing right away. We want to have specific protocols when we're dealing with products, and have access to information quickly, which is why we say, how do I get more information? So it shouldn't be, and I've asked this question before when I go to workplaces, where do you guys keep your safety data sheets? And sometimes they're like, yeah, where do we keep them? Hey, John, do you know where we keep the safety data sheets? Yeah, we keep them in under the desk there. And then somebody goes and they look, oh, they're not here. Okay. And all of a sudden, that should never be the case, where people don't know where to get this information. When people have an injury or an incident that's induced by a hazardous product, we don't have a ton of time to act. Somebody could lose their vision. It could be, even worse than that if there's a fire. There's a lot of things that can go wrong if we don't have access to the information that we need when we need it. And like I said, when we're talking about these products, we have seconds to act. We don't have minutes, hours, right? This stuff needs to happen very quickly. Again, why you need a strong WHMIS program at your workplace and emergency protocols and procedures. We need to be able to act quickly, efficiently, and effectively, and make sure that if we need more information, that we know where to get those safety data sheets so that somebody can read into that stuff while we're giving first aid to that person. So again, workers need to be able to answer these 4 questions. What is the hazard? How do I protect myself? What do I do in the event of an incident? How do I get more information, right? It's going to be nearly impossible for some employers to train their workers on every single product at their workplace. Some of them, like I said, will have a dozen products or less. Many employers have much more than that. So what becomes essential is accessing information and accessing it quickly, right? And that should be part and parcel with the training and education program is how do we get access to the information? Where can it be found? And ensuring workers are trained so that they, again, know how to act and they can act quickly. Kind of touched on a bit of this, I guess, or I got a bit ahead of myself, but emergency preparedness, again, WHMIS 2015, it's going to include kind of general guidelines for emergency preparedness. But it's going to state things like the employer should develop emergency response plans, install appropriate alarm systems, right? They're going to discuss the importance of evacuation procedures and a general guideline for spill response. When we look at it at the site specific level, it's what do we do if there's a chemical spill? What kind of products for specific products? Where can we get the spill kits? Where are they located? How do we use them? What do we do if there's a fire? What's our fire safety plan, right? Are workers trained to it? Is it posted in the facility? What do we do if we get a product in our eyes, right? Do we have eye wash stations available? Where are they located in proximity to those hazards, right? And then training workers on how to use that eye wash station. I think probably one of the more disappointing things I see is these eye wash stations are typically not properly maintained and inspected, and they need to be if you have hazardous products at your business, and chances are you do, right? And then again, list controlled products on site that's readily available upon request in the event of an emergency, right? If we have fire marshals or the fire department respond to an emergency, they're going to want to know where certain products are, especially your flammables. They're going to want to know where they are, what quantity do we have them in, so that they know how to go about their business accordingly as well, right? So make sure that information is available and provided. So again, that's site specific versus that general information. And then finally, reviewing and updating information. This kind of goes part and parcel, one and the same. But again, for WHMIS 2015, ensuring all workers have received that training that are affected by it, right? If you're exposed or you use hazardous products or could be exposed to them, you need to have WHMIS 2015 training. We need to ensure that we've got a list of our workers and who's received that training, and anybody that's going to be a new worker that we're onboarding, that they get this training prior to starting work. And then on the site specific level, again, it's reviewing those safety data sheets annually, make sure we create a hazardous product inventory list. We're giving workers training on all the things that we've mentioned and ensuring if anything changes that have affected the program, that we update our program to reflect those changes. So the last topic we're going to cover is how do we implement a WHMIS program at our place? And I'm going to give you some really good tools at the end of this that I'm going to send out to you. They're going to allow you to be more effective in terms of analyzing your own WHMIS program if you have one, or developing one if you don't. So I hope this kind of adds a little bit of punch to your WHMIS programs. So let's talk about what are the main elements of a WHMIS program. So we're going to go through it. There's 6 elements essentially that you need to cover off in your WHMIS program to be effective. One is we go with the purchasing and inventory. So employers have a responsibility to know at all times what hazardous products are in their workplace and in what quantities. You need to know that information. A good chemical or product inventory system and procurement procedures is going to help you accomplish this, and it's essential to have that effective WHMIS program. Typically, the responsibility of the person in charge of procurement should be the one that develops and maintains this inventory list. And for your business, you're going to know who those people are, and do whatever is most effective and efficient for your business. So that product inventory, we kind of showed you an example of one. It's going to help you to make that workplace or your workplace safer by knowing exactly what products you have, what quantities you have them in, and where those products are going to be stored, right? When we're getting those products and we're looking through that information, it's going to give us some clues as to, hey, this needs to be stored in a flammable cabinet, or this needs to be with corrosives or oxidizers, whatever the case is. I think we often come across compressed gas cylinders stored with other incompatible gas cylinders. That, I don't want to say it should never happen. It should never happen. I mean, really, it's about, like I said, if you have a good inventory system, and you've read through the information, you're going to know this stuff, right? As opposed to me coming through in an inspection and letting you know. But having said that, obviously that's what we're here for, is to educate people and let them know, educate our employers and let them know that, hey, this is what you're doing wrong. This is what you should be doing. So obviously we encourage you to do both things, get the information that you need. And if you don't know, talk to professionals who do. So your product inventory is also going to help you maintain an up-to-date list of all your products and ensure you have up-to-date supplier labels and safety data sheets for those products. It's going to allow you to identify and remove any excess, unused, or unnecessary products in your building. Excuse me. It's going to help you implement proper storage and handling techniques. And it's going to help you isolate and store the most hazardous products securely, right? That's a big one. We don't just want those really high risk products or very hazardous products to be just stored with anything else, right? We want to bring attention to those things and make sure that they're stored in a manner that reflects the hazard present. And ultimately, this can help you comply with what the regulatory requirements are, what the law requires of you to do. Hazard identification. So when a product's brought into the workplace, it's essential to know the hazards of that product, right? So a summary of the hazards is found on that safety data sheet that we mentioned. Knowing the hazards is going to help you make informed decisions about how to use, store, dispose of, educate, train workers on, and those emergency response protocols. It's going to help you understand all of this information. And again, we have to ensure that our workers understand how to access this information. And like I said, your WHMIS 2015 training is going to give them the general guidelines on what they can expect in there, what that stuff all means. So under our WHMIS legislation, employers who produce hazardous products for use in their own workplaces have a duty to assess the hazards, classify them, the hazards of the products, and provide proper safety data sheets and labels. This is going to be few and far between for businesses within our membership group, but there are a few members that do produce their own products. So that's essential for you folks to know if you're doing that at your business. Again, under general occupational health and safety laws, employers are responsible for safe storage and use of those products. How about inspections? Again, this is a key proactive component of any safety management system. Make sure all hazardous products are labeled appropriately in the SDS are available. So how do we do this? Let's include WHMIS requirements on our inspection checklist. You might even have your own checklist specific to WHMIS products. And that checklist might have things on it, such as, are the containers in good condition? Are labels in good condition? Are any hazardous products present without a label? Do workers know how to read the label before using a hazardous product? Do workers know that they must not use a hazardous product which is not labeled? Are all decanted products which are not immediately used by the person who decanted them labeled with a workplace label? Are safety data sheets available in an accessible location for all workers? right? So we can ask a list of questions here, and this is going to do two things. Number one, it's going to allow us to find out if there's any deficiencies at our business. Number two, you can actually, as part of the education and training, it's interesting, our legislation doesn't state explicitly how you can go about doing this education and training. They do mention, though, what needs to be included in it. In terms of how you go about doing the education and training, they leave that pretty wide open for you folks to do. And again, when we're looking at mitigating risk, this is all part of that, right? I always like to say, you're not going to be able to reduce the risk of everything to zero, but we have a responsibility to try and get the risk as close to zero as possible. So we need to hone in on those certain products that are used daily, those products that we know are more serious in nature in terms of the hazard that they pose. And when you're doing your inspections, this will allow you to kind of test workers a little bit as you're going through this. So we talk about education and training. Well, when we get into that piece here in a moment, we're going to talk about maybe how that can look for you, because that's what we get often is, how do I train this stuff at a site-specific level? Does everything require a quiz or a test? How do I do this? So we're going to talk about that here in just 1 second. So education and training. So it states that all workers who work with a hazardous product must learn about the hazards associated with these products. So not only if they work with a product, or even if they might be exposed to a hazardous product, they need to learn about the hazards of those products. So the hazard information that should be included and provided to our workers. Sorry, I just lost my spot there. The hazard information should include the information received from the supplier. So when the supplier gives you those safety data sheets and they label their products, as well as any information that the employer is aware of about the safe use, storage, and handling of that product, that information needs to be provided to the workers, right? So examples of some topics that you could kind of include during your education and training. Some of these are stated explicitly in our legislation. And so I'm going to cover those off. So see, here's an example of some of the things that you would want to include. The information on both the supplier label and workplace label, when each is required and what that information means. Again, this is going to be a combination of that information we get from WHMIS 2015 and on-site training. The information on the safety data sheet and what that information means. The procedures required for the safe use, handling, and disposal of each hazardous product. Any other procedures that are required when a product is in a piping system, vessel, tank, or tank car, all procedures that must be followed in an emergency that involve the hazardous product. And again, it all comes back to workers should be able to answer these questions for any product that they work with. What's the hazard of the product? How do I protect myself from those hazards? What do I do in the event of an emergency? Where can I get more information, right? So when we're talking about this, again, this can look differently, I guess, depending on your workplace. Again, if you've got maybe dozens of chemicals that you work with, we might say, hey, we're going to take maybe 20 of these items. I've seen this done differently, and we're going to develop a PowerPoint presentation on them. And at the end, we're going to have a quiz. Now, you may not quiz the worker on every product, but what you might say is, I'm going to give you a safety data sheet, or I'm going to give you a product. I want you to go find me the information about this product. And again, that might ask, what are the hazards of the product? How do I protect myself? What PPE do I need? What do I do if there's an emergency with that product? And then finally, where can I get further information? And they might say, you can get further information from safety data sheets, reach out to the supplier, talk to my supervisor, et cetera, right? So we can train it that way. Our legislation, states that you can use kind of a combination of you can use kind of a combination of tactics, I guess you could say, to train your workers and educate them at your workplace. And I actually just want to read this verbatim from our legislation, because I think it's going to give you some indicators that they've left this somewhat open for you. And so it states that an employer shall ensure that education and training required is developed and implemented for that place of employment and in consultation with your health committees or safety representatives. And an employer shall ensure that the education and training required results in a worker being able to apply the information as needed to protect the health and safety of that worker or any other worker, and that the knowledge of the workers is periodically evaluated using written tests, practical demonstrations, or other suitable means. So they've given you the option in terms of how you want to train this and educate your workers at your workplace. Okay, so again, practical demonstrations, written tests, or other suitable means. Maybe use a combination of them, right? And again, when we're looking at this, let's look at the risk. Let's classify our products. Let's organize them by risk. Then let's organize by how frequently are we using these products, right? If we're using them frequently, those are products that we definitely want to administer more of a regimented training for and maybe have a test for. Whereas some of the other things, we might more test the worker's competence in terms of, hey, if you come across this product, what do you do in this situation, right? That could be just a spot test by a supervisor, and we're just going to evaluate the competence of that worker. Where do you find the safety data sheets? They find them out for us. Okay, can you find me this product? They show us how to find that product. They find the product. What's the first aid measure for it? They look through the safety data sheet, identify. So again, how you go about doing this is ultimately up to you. The big factor here is risk mitigation, right? How do we bring our risk of exposure or possibly an incident as close to zero as possible? Focus on those products that are the most hazardous. Focus on those products that we use the most. And then in terms of, like I said, testing people's knowledge for how to find information about the other stuff. Because the reality of it is, you're not going to remember everything about every product on every safety data sheet, no matter how often we test it. Now, that's going to depend on, again, how many chemicals we're using. The biggest thing that I can possibly, I guess, give you in terms of how you should be looking at this is, again, what's the risk here? Is it high? Is it low? And how do workers access information if they come across a product that, hey, this is the first time I'm using it, how do I access information to it? What do these labels mean? What does this information mean? And having safe work procedures that address this. So if you ever, part of your procedure for anything, if you're going to use a hazardous product for a certain job or task, part of that safe work procedure is read the label of the hazardous product you're using and ensure you know XYZ information, right? What the hazards are. How do I protect myself? What happened? What do I do in the case of an emergency? Where do I get further information, right? Again, it all comes back to those four main questions of being able to answer them. So, like I said, absent of any training with a certain product, we need to train our workers that if you have not used a product before or you're unfamiliar with it, you need to read the label. You should also read the safety data sheet, right? So again, really driving that part of it home. Let's move on to the next one, review and evaluation. So the WHMIS program should be reviewed at least annually or more often if there's changes in the working conditions, right, or products used. Is the frequency of conducting our chemical inventory, our safety data sheet inventory, is it adequate? Are our floor plans and emergency plans up to date? Are they posted in our facility? Excuse me. This review would also determine if the current WHMIS education training maybe needs to be improved or upgraded, and ensure that all hazardous products that the workers are exposed to are identified. And some of that refresher education training, you may need to administer it as needed to protect the health and safety of your workers, or if the conditions have changed, or if we've introduced new hazardous products into the workplace. So it's staying up to date on this information, right? And making sure that our workers are educated and understand that information as well. Document and record keeping. So documents and records, they help the employer ultimately show their due diligence and compliance with our WHMIS legislation. How long documents and records must be kept? It's going to vary from province to province. examples of kind of those documents may include the actual education and training material you're giving workers, any inventory lists we've kept, safety data sheets, inspection checklists, things like that. All those documents should be dated and indicate if we've had any revisions. You might need to keep your safety data sheets on record for a set period of time. Unfortunately, our legislation here doesn't have a specific minimum retention period for this stuff. So any employer will need to keep their safety data sheets on record, but the majority of other provinces that have legislation pertaining to hazardous substances, they'll have a retention period of 10 years, and Manitoba, I believe, is the longest, being 30 years. And New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan are the three territories that don't list specific minimum retention periods for hazardous substances. So I would recommend that you, for a best practice, adhere to the longest one, which would be 30 years. Again, kind of buyer beware sort of thing. I would use the best practice of adhering to the not the minimum standard, but the maximum standard that's been set, and that'll ensure that you're on good ground if anything should happen. So that kind of concludes that piece. And then finally, guys, I'm going to actually send you out a document. I'm not going to go into detail on each and every one of these, but I'm going to send you a document that kind of has a bit of an implementation plan or strategy that you can use to implement a program at your workplace. So it's going to cover off assigning responsibilities for that implementation, how to establish an inventory of hazardous products that you use. It's going to cover off the WHMIS labels and safety data sheets, determining hazards and workplace controls at your workplace, the emergency procedures that you should be considering and the things you should be considering around that site specifically, any worker education and training that we kind of covered off, some of the key components of that. How to evaluate your WHMIS program, and how to ultimately audit your own program internally. So I'm going to send you that document as well, and that's going to kind of give you some information on how you can go about doing this at your workplace. So that concludes our webinar. It's a lot of information in a short period of time. Like I said, I wanted to be as to the point as possible. I know that we get a lot of questions about this stuff. And to be quite honest, when we're out doing inspections, we often see some form of non-compliance when it comes to WHMIS in one way, shape, or form. So if you have questions, please put them in the question box now. I'll be logging off here momentarily, and feel free to reach out to us anytime. We can come and help you out with this stuff. Please check our website out as well. We've got a lot of great information on there. Yeah, like I said, we've got workplace labels, all kinds of stuff. We've actually developed our own WHMIS 2015 training program. So obviously, if you're members of ours, you get free access to that. So don't send workers out and pay, $10-15 a head per worker for this training. We offer it for you folks for free. It is a certified program. So please go ahead, and if you haven't taken WHMIS 2015, or you have workers that need it, go to www.motorsafety.ca, register them there, and get them trained up on this stuff. So I am going to bid you farewell. Thank you so much for being with me here today. I appreciate your attendance, and I hope you folks have a great rest of your summer and a safe summer. And like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of us at 721-0688, email info@motorsafety.ca, or go to our website and check out our information on there. So have yourselves a good one. Appreciate you folks being here today, and have yourselves a great rest of your summer. Take care for now. Bye-bye.